In the second chapter of the Malleus Maleficarum, Heinrich Kramer asks the question, if it be in accordance with the Catholic faith to maintain that in order to bring about some effect of magic, the devil must intimately cooperate with the witch, or whether one without the other, this is to say, the devil without the witch, or conversely, could produce such an effect. And yes, you'll find that Kramer had a knack for making simple questions almost unintelligible. Or at least, the translator, Montague Summers, certainly had some difficulty in translating the original Latin into more comprehensible English. But put simply, this tongue twister of a question is Kramer merely asking whether or not the devil influenced the witch, or if the witch called upon the devil, and whether the two could act independently to create magic and spells. Kramer begins this chapter by tackling the argument that the devil works alone in his conjurings of dark magic, and proposes an idea by St. Augustine that bodily ills and ailments, those which were not visible and could not be detected by one's senses, were brought about by the devil. There does not seem to be much elaboration as to St. Augustine's view on this, but merely the fact that because some ailments could not be seen, I imagine he is referring to internal diseases or sicknesses that were not diagnosable at the time, they therefore carried a certain mystery and foreboding, which would make them easily associated with the devil. With this, the devil could be blamed for various maladies that simply were not understood at the time. And this would not only provide some satiation of curiosities of the time, but would also further vilify the devil and strengthen the belief in good and evil. With the devil being blamed for these calamities of the body, Kramer reinforces the idea by speaking of Job from the Bible, who the Bible tells us was victim to ailments that were cast by the devil himself. With the devil being exemplified as producing sores on Job's body, it would make sense that people at the time would certainly believe that he was capable of doing such a thing. And so, when one person or another was struck down by some horrible sickness, blaming the devil was not such an outlandish diagnosis. Kramer tells us of Job, we learn from the Holy Scriptures of the disasters which fell upon Job, how fire fell from heaven, and striking the sheep and the servants, consumed them, and how violent a wind threw down the four corners of a house, so that it fell upon his children, and slew them all. As we can see, Kramer provides not only the gist of the tale, but also some ideas as to the devil's power, who in the biblical story can not only cast fire upon Job's land, but also kill his servants, his animals, and can manipulate the wind into collapsing his home and crushing his family. But the real point Kramer is trying to make here is not to celebrate or present the devil's powers, but instead to showcase him as operating without the cooperation of witches, and that the devil was capable of doing evil all on his own. In fact, he notes that he is able to cause many disasters upon Job that, whilst devastating, only take place because God allows it to happen. For those who don't know the story of Job, God and the devil essentially have a disagreement over how loyal Job is, where the devil argues that Job only serves God because God had blessed him. The devil argues that if God took away all of his blessings, then Job would curse him. With that, God tells the devil to do his worst, and that when he is done, Job will still serve him. With this, Kramer coincides with his previous points in the last chapter, that the devil's power is only operational if God permits it. Yet with this deliberation, Kramer concludes that the devil can indeed work without the cooperation of witches, and that whilst many of his spells and sorceries are often ascribed to the work of witches, he proves, from at least a biblical perspective, that he does not need them for the purposes of magic. Kramer continues that it's more likely that the devil makes use of a witch, not because he requires their assistance, but more so because he is seeking her downfall. He knows that society will shun her, and knows that the penalty of her being caught would be torture and death. Furthermore, the devil was also aware that if he was able to get a witch to indulge in witchcraft, she would be foregoing her place in heaven, and much is the devil's motive, he seeks to lure the witch off the righteous path and away from God. Kramer continues that the devil employs the witch not necessarily as a minion, but more like an instrument. Interestingly, Kramer actually suggests a defense for the witch here, arguing that because an instrument does not have free will, it cannot be accused of guilt. With this notion, a witch under these circumstances should not have been punished, because they were not acting under their own volition. But another idea that Kramer speaks of is that the devil cannot harm mankind easily, and that it is far easier for him to have witches and sorcerers do his bidding for him. Additionally, Kramer also details an argument of the devil being a spirit, and that because of his form, he is unable to physically affect humans. Therefore, he must rely on witches and sorcerers to do his bidding for him, for it is through them, and only them, that his malice upon the rest of the human race can be achieved. Kramer reinforces this idea by quoting Persian polymath Avicenna in his book Naturalism, where he states, "Very often, the soul may have as much influence upon the body of another to the same extent as it has upon its own body, for such is the influence of the eyes of anyone who by his glance attracts and fascinates another." Here Kramer seeks to show us that the soul can be considered a real thing, and because it is not necessarily tangible, it is something that the devil cannot perceive, nor manipulate either. Therefore, we can see from Avicenna's words that the soul can be influenced by another, thus forcing the devil to lure others into doing his bidding. Yet Kramer does not acknowledge Avicenna's thoughts on the power of imagination, and that the soul could in fact very well be a figment of one's imagination, which you may also apply to Kramer's points in the previous chapter, when discussing the argument of witchcraft being real or not, where he makes note of one argument proposing that magic was the creation of an overactive imagination. In fact, Kramer continues in agreement of the power of imagination in this section, providing us with an example of how imagination can affect a man, telling us, "Such a power of imagination can change adjacent bodies, as, for example, when a man is able to walk along some narrow beam which is stretched down the middle of a street. But yet if this beam were suspended over deep water, he would not dare to walk along it, because his imagination would most strongly impress upon his mind the idea of falling, and therefore his body and the power of his limbs would not obey his imagination, and they would not obey the contrary thereto, that is to say, walking directly and without hesitation." Yet Kramer continues that there are things in the world that are beyond imagination, such as the mineral magnetite lodestone, which he states attracts steel and many other such things without any conceivable reason. Of course, lodestone is naturally magnetic, but it is unclear how much understanding Kramer had in regards to this mineral. Still, it leads him on to his next statement, in that witches make use of various items such as herbs, and that they don't get this knowledge from the devil, but instead study it themselves. With this, he conveys that the witches are able to create remedies from these various objects, but that they are also able to create dastardly spells and curses, those that should not necessarily be ascribed to the devil, because the witches take responsibility for these earthly items themselves. Though Kramer does not provide any sense of an argument in regards to the devil luring the witches towards these items, nor is he specific to which items he refers to. Furthermore, he decides this is all done without the aid of the devil, but he does not provide a reason as to why. He continues that witches use certain images and strange charms, which they position under the lintels of doors of houses, in the meadows where there are flocks, or in areas where men are known to congregate. By doing this, Kramer determines that the witch is able to cast spells over her victims, and that these images and charms facilitate their sorcery, allowing the witch to even kill those who are within range. But again, Kramer also provides an alternative argument for this idea, and that it is the stars which influence a man's life, and it is the alignment of the stars which have the effect over a man's fate, not the images or charms that a witch utilizes. However, he does also propose that if a witch uses her charms for the benefit of her target, for example, if she heals him of an ailment, then this should not be associated with evil or the devil, for the witch is working in tandem with the stars and the heavenly bodies. This would link in with the idea that prayer is also able to alter reality, perhaps in a more benign way than sorcery does, and in some capacity, everyone has the ability to affect the world, or manifest desired outcomes into reality. He mentions Saint Gregory and his work in the second dialogue, where we are told of the power of both prayer and the power of the saints, who can perform miracles. Here Kramer makes note of Saint Peter, who by praying was able to bring Tabitha back to life, and that this was evidence that man, through sheer mental influence alone, could alter reality around them, and have some profound effect on the material body of another. Furthermore, through this mental influence, or through prayer, a person could alter the sickly condition of another into a healthier one, and conversely. Put simply, the point Kramer is trying to make here is that if prayer and this mental influence of the saints is able to affect the state of another, then witchcraft and sorcery used by witches would certainly have the same potency too, albeit from a much darker source. Kramer continues to tell us of another argument supported by Saint Isidore in his etymology, and that those who make excuses for the witches, saying that they were merely instruments of the devil, were wrong, and that it was naive to mistake witchcraft and sorcery for some natural occurrence. He quotes Saint Isidore saying, "Witches are so called on the account of the blackness of their guilt, that is to say, their deeds are more evil than those of any other malefactors." With this, Kramer presents the idea that the witch, with or without the devil, was still a most detestable figure, and that those who practice the dark arts should be viewed as wicked. He does go on to mention the witch in conjunction with the devil from Saint Isidore's writings, saying, "They stir up and confound the elements by the aid of the devil, and arouse terrible hailstorms and tempests. Moreover, they distract the minds of men, driving them to madness, insane hatred, and inordinate lusts." Here we get a glimpse of a more terrifying witch, one who, with the aid of the devil, can produce some disastrous and even calamitous conditions, including control over the weather to bring about storms and tempests. Witches creating storms was also something that witches became notorious for, particularly in the late 16th century, when King James VI came to believe that witches had conjured a storm to kill him when he was returning home from Denmark on a voyage. Kramer then turns his focus upon the male variety of witches, as he references St. Augustine in his book, The City of God. These male witches, those who he dubs as magicians, were thought to have been those who disturbed the elements and sought to distract men with evil spells in an effort to lure them away from God. He continues, that with this terrible power, magicians could kill other people, and that they, like the witches, were of the darkest intentions. To accentuate this point, Kramer quotes the Roman poet Lucan, telling us, "A mind which has not been corrupted by any noxious drink perishes, forspoken by some evil charm. For having summoned devils to their aid, they actually dare to heap harms upon mankind, and even to destroy their enemies by their evil spells." Kramer then begins to go off on a little tirade about punishments, and provides us with the idea that there are 4 kinds of punishments. Those which he deems are beneficial punishments, hurtful punishments, punishments wrought by witchcraft, and natural punishments. However, he spends most of the time talking about the beneficial punishments and the hurtful punishments, which he believed were disseminated by angels and evil spirits respectively. He provides a biblical example to support his claim, telling us that when Moses had smote Egypt with the 10 plagues, this had been facilitated by the ministry of good angels, and thus was a beneficial punishment. Meanwhile, the Pharaoh's magicians, who were working against Moses, were only able to perform 3 of the plagues, those which were facilitated by the aid of the devil, and thus became a hurtful punishment. Because the Pharaoh's magicians were not able to replicate all of the miracles performed by Moses, Kramer presents the idea that beneficial punishments are far more potent than hurtful punishments, and that by going by this, the angels and the forces of good are far stronger than the devil and the forces of evil. He provides a second example of this beneficial punishment, where because of the sin of David, pestilence fell upon his people, and 72,000 men were slain in one night. These, Kramer tells us, were miracles wrought by the angels of God, that is, by good angels who feared God, and knew that they were carrying out his commands. With this, beneficial punishments and the power of the angels seem to certainly preside over anything that the devil is able to muster, suggesting that a man might be better off turning to prayer and God than witchcraft and the devil. For time and time again, we see sorcery and the devil fall short when confronted by the Most Holy. Yet that isn't to say that hurtful punishments and the sorcery of the devil is useless, nor should it be scoffed at. In fact, perhaps because of how potent the devil's magic appears, it might be all the more tempting to engage with. Kramer recognized this and continued to suggest that bad angels, or fallen angels, afflicted the children of Israel, and that it was these harms, which were simply evil, that were brought about by the devil. In this quite brief and ambiguous section, Kramer hints that the devil not only has the witches and sorcerers at his disposal, but also a host of fallen wicked angels that might also facilitate the dark arts in the same way that the good angels facilitate miracles. Finally, Kramer does not mention the natural punishments that take place, though he very briefly notes that they are in some manner dependent on the conjunction of heavenly bodies and the arbitrary decisions of nature, those which no one can control except God. The chapter concludes with another reference to Job, though in conjunction with Kramer's idea of harmful punishments. Here, Kramer tells us that Job was afflicted by the devil with a harmful punishment, but that this had nothing to do with sorcery or witchcraft, but instead was the devil's own power. He notes that indeed, while the devil did act here without the aid of a witch or a magician, and that whilst this did suggest that the devil needed no witch or magician to harm a man, that this was not the point of the story of Job, and that those who ponder on this are missing the point of the narrative. He continues that in the time of Job there were no sorcerers and witches, and that such abominations were not yet practiced. But then you might ask, how did the devil affect Job in the way that he did, going on to turn him weary and weak and afflict him to painful sores all over his body? Well, it could simply be argued that God allowed the devil to do this to prove his eventual point, that Job would still praise him. But Kramer provides a different perspective, more relevant to the idea of sorcery and witchcraft, in that God wished to use Job as an example of how the power of the devil could manifest over man, so that man might be more prepared to guard against not only Satan, but also the spells of the witch. Let me know what you thought about today's installment on Hammer of Witches, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.